This lecture continues with ancient Rome, looking at the time capsule that is preserved in Pompeii and Herculaneum, where we find we can reconstruct life in the late Republic and early Empire. The cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum are going to be at the base of Mount Vesuvius in the Bay of Naples in the Tyrrhenian Sea. These cities will be perfectly preserved thanks to the volcanic ash and debris that was spewed into the air, preserving for us a Roman city in all of its various facets. On August 24th, 79 Common Era, we have an account, thanks to the Roman historian Pliny the Elder, of what happened when Mount Vesuvius erupted, the first recorded event in the West of volcanology. They had no concept of what a volcano was prior to 79. Here we find the civilization would have been buried for nearly 1,700 years. This allows us to reconstruct what happens in the late Republic and early Empire by way of domestic living, how many slaves a household would have had, money and or pets, a variety of things that we can do to reconstruct what daily life was like, including dentist offices and physicians. When the eruption first occurred, people did not initially leave. We find that Pliny the Elder is watching from across the Bay of Naples, safe from the eruption itself, and he records all stages of the event. Later it was said to be the wrath of the gods, but Pliny the Elder is going to be an early scientist, and so he records it as a geological event. The excavation of these ruins would not take place until 1,700 years later, when in 1738 Herculaneum is going to be unearthed, followed by Pompeii in 1748, under the auspice and guidance of the first archaeologist and art historian, Joachim Winckelmann. The excavation of Pompeii still continues to this day, where we still uncover bodies that are very wonderfully preserved, showing us what happens when they're going to suffocate instead of burning to death. But we can reconstruct how many there were, the gender of these individuals, and then the households in which they lived. This is going to overlap the late Republican era as we transition in 27 BCE to the Empire when Augustus takes over, becoming the first emperor, until we move into the early imperial period in the 1st century Common Era. Pompeii, like all Roman cities, would have had specific structures that were required in order to entertain and worship the gods, as well as provide various domestic and religious opportunities for its inhabitants. We know that Pompeii is built between 200 BCE and 79 Common Era as a very wealthy port city on the Bay of Naples. The population is going to exceed 20,000 when the first earthquake hits in 62 Common Era. We know that repairs were still in progress nearly 2 decades later when Vesuvius finally erupts, the inhabitants having no idea the initial earthquake would have been a tremor related to volcanology. We know that Roman cities needed to have a forum, which is a public area or a place to gather like the agora for the ancient Greeks. Then they need to have a theater that is taken from the Greek civilization, where we have religious festivals and plays would be performed. Then we have an amphitheater, a separate structure that would have been used for blood sport that is specifically Roman. Here we find the forum, the center of civic life, where the roofs are missing on most of these structures because they collapsed under the weight of all of the debris spewed into the air by Vesuvius. The significance, though, of these central open-air gatherings cannot be overstated. We know that this is where you would have had a basilica, which is the main community center, if you will, gathering place or law court, as well as other places to exchange goods and services, to debate politics, etc. In the forum, you would have had the temple to the Capitoline Triad, the 3 most important gods for the ancient Romans, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. We find that the tripartite shrine they would have adopted from the Etruscans, as we discussed. Next to it, we have a temple to the god Apollo, the god of the sun, and then a basilica, which is going to be that secular center to debate in. That will be very important because the basilica will become the model for early Christian churches. Here we would have had daily commerce, just like in the ancient Greek agora carried out. Festivals would also be held here. The law court for the basilica is going to bring together the architecture, as with the temples of ancient Rome, of ancient Greece and Etruria. These earlier civilizations are going to provide the architectural know-how that the Romans will adopt and make their own. The large hall with side aisles and a clear story that is going to be the Roman basilica will become the model for these early Christian churches. However, what we would consider the most auspicious and obvious architecture that's associated with ancient Rome, we would turn to the amphitheater, which was begun shortly after the Romans took control of the city from the Greek outposts and colonists that were going to be here before. Now, amphitheaters, and when they are built, tell us that they are central to Roman civilization and are necessary to entertain the public at large. They do not generally charge for entrance, and so you find that the taxes in an area generally pay for it along with wealthy benefactors. It was seen as necessary as a kind of release valve, a social release valve, in order to keep the public in control. Now, this is going to, like all amphitheaters, be large enough to seat the entire populace at the same time, because it seats 20,000. Obviously, 20,000 people are not going to abandon their daily lives and or festivals, activities, and mercantile activities to go to an amphitheater. So this is more than enough room for everyone in the city at any given time. Now, just as with the Colosseum in Rome, amphitheaters are going to be seated by rank. So just as Rome is going to be a military civilization, the seating is going to reflect that. So civilian life reflects military life in rank, all the way up to the emperor, or the general, right, we should say, in a military sense. The most wealthy members of society get to sit closest. Here, what we find with an amphitheater, literally meaning double theater, we take two Greek theaters and place them end to end. We combine them so they are now in the round. Greek theaters earlier are going to be built on natural hills or outcroppings so that the acoustics are going to naturally be reinforced and amplified. So the Greeks are going to choose the natural environment of the hilly landscape around them, while the Romans, true to their architectural nature, build artificial mountains out of concrete. So this is not going to be a natural hill, but is built up in a series of arcades, right, and or barrel vaults. The elliptical cavea seen here is the seating area that the Romans are going to invent to see in the round the events that are taking place and transpiring below on the sand, which of course is going to be in Latin arena. So in the arena where the action takes place. Looking at the side of the amphitheater here at Pompeii, you can see how they save materiel by adding barrel vaults. So these stacked barrel vaults are in fact going to support the weight of the seats, of the cavea, of the structure, which allow us to exit in all directions and enter in multiple directions. So these concrete barrel vaults are going to take less material and are stronger than a standard wall. So the double staircases, you can walk up and down either direction. Thus, just like the Colosseum, we have a very efficient method of getting people in and out. Again, when we hear the word arena, we think of the central place where action transpires in the center of these massive complexes. But in fact, arena is Latin for sand, which was used to soak up the blood as it's going to be spilled on the arena floor. It cleans it up nicely. So we know this is for blood sport, not the type of high-minded intellectual or emotional plays that would have been read in Greek theaters. The architecture, and thus the function as well, is different from that of the Greeks. For gladiatorial combat and violence is going to be the main event that would be seen here. However, just because people were dying on the arena floor does not mean that the visitors, that the audience need to be uncomfortable. There is a velarium shown here in the brawl in the Pompeii Amphitheater fresco in one of the houses in Pompeii. And a velarium is going to be an awning and or a cloth that goes over the top of the seating, the cavea, so that you have been shaded and air conditioned if you're going to be here all day watching the games. The preferred and most popular event in amphitheaters certainly is gladiatorial combat, and they are going to be held up of the rock stars of their day in mosaics and images all around Pompeii. We have love letters and inscriptions on the walls of women writing to these men, and of course they're going to be right next door as far as their barracks, living there, training. But contrary to popular belief, they did not fight to the death every time. Only when one fought poorly and or was undertrained would they die. And they are, of course, also not the only event you would see in an amphitheater. They have everything from executions to plays to men fighting wild animals, and we'll return to this later when we look at the Colosseum. Turning to domestic architecture, we have an example of surviving in Pompeii, what freed slaves can actually accomplish, showing how different the notion of slavery is in ancient Rome to that of, say, 19th century America, because it was not based on one's ethnicity, creed, or otherwise. Instead, anyone could be sold into slavery. In fact, you can sell yourself into slavery. When freed, of course, you can work your way up the social ladder until you can afford a very large villa, such as the Vetii house we'll look at now. So the House of the Vetii is going to have a standard design for Roman domestic architecture with gardens, with a peristyle set of columns, with a dining room, with bedrooms, a home office. So just to show you, you enter in the lower section here, moving into the interior space. And in fact, Roman domestic architecture is designed to look inward. So we have an atrium, a reception area, next to it several small cubicula or bedrooms where people will sleep if they're going to come over for a celebration or a feast in the dining room, the triclinium. Now we know that business is going to be conducted on the premises, so we not only entertain people in the dining room, the triclinium, we also do business with them in the home office or tablinum. So the tablinum we tabulate obviously in here, but in the very center we have a garden and a peristyle of columns that show us we are going to be looking inward to turn our focus away from the hustle and bustle of the outside world. The front half, in fact, of Roman domestic structures or villas resembles Etruscan domiciles in the beds as they are laid out as soon as you enter, an open section where you gather at an atrium, and then further dining areas where you can relax further in. The Greek peristyle garden is added to this, where in Greek villas we would have an open air or, once again, a hypaethral section of the structure that opens up, where you can grow, once again, a garden in the center of your home. This bringing together, again, the notion of Roman eclecticism or Greek and Etruscan architecture brought together here. Here we're looking into the fauces in this atrium, and you can see the garden beyond. This is owned by the Vetii, who are freedmen who were once slaves. They became merchants. So before, in Rome especially, only patricians could afford a villa this size. But in the provinces, in these areas, out in the sections away from Rome proper, they can afford a larger, sprawling manor. And the idea is, again, to block the outside world, block the exterior, to add a type of sanctuary and an appeal that is interior focused here. So in images of ancient Rome, we see people lounging around the central garden, this lush green oasis in the middle of a bustling city, where we must remember there is not plumbing and or sewage lines, and so we find that there's raw sewage in the streets. It is filthy outside. Dead animals line the streets, right? So we find that the interior is a sanctuary for those that can afford it. Here we have a rare example that we would not find in larger cities, because in Rome we do not have the space for these gardens. Even the wealthiest members of society would have been restricted to the size, given that Rome has over 1 million people by the turn of the millennium. Instead, Romans are going to live in apartment buildings like this, and just as people today, where most humans on Earth are going to live in high-rise apartment structures, instead of sprawling estates or manors with only a few people occupying them. In these apartment buildings, the lower sections, just as in large cities today, would be dedicated to shops. So you would have fast food, you would have leather workers and tanners, butchers and bakers, and then you would live on the upper stories. The wealth in Pompeii extends beyond merely the architecture, but the decoration also shows us how much money this series of merchants had, because the walls are extensively decorated all around in buon fresco or true fresco, painted on wet lime plaster. And in the short amount of time that we have here in Pompeii, we see a rapid stylistic development with 4 Pompeian styles, first identified by August Mao. The first of these 4 styles lasts from 200 to 80 BCE and imitated costly imported marble that would be used to reinforce the wall itself. The painted stucco relief as seen here was common in Greece, where it came from, and in the late 4th century BCE onward became very popular in Roman interior decoration and design. This interest in illusionism began earlier in the second style, where we find the best surviving example in sets of frescoes in the Villa of Mysteries, whereby from 80 to 15 BCE, we develop a 3-dimensional world that projects in a very shallow space beyond the wall itself. Here we have an initiation chamber for the mysteries relating to the cult of Dionysus, which was a woman-only cult in ancient Greece and Rome. So popular among women, they would initiate new women in this room, emulating Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos, who marries Dionysus, much as St. Catherine would marry Christ in the Christian tradition. So we find that these initiates become the wife of Dionysus. The Maenads, as you see them here, and that would have been in this initiation ritual, are worshippers of Dionysus, and they are women. For this is an Eastern mystery cult where they would get together, drink until they are going to be intoxicated, rip apart raw animal flesh and eat it, and dance. We should note here that all the mortal figures are female on this shallow stage-like space that runs around the length of the room on this small ledge. They are nearly life-size, as the same size as the figures that would be witnessing the images. The backdrop, we find, are going to be panels that imitate marble, which is the first Pompeian style. The actors move on this shallow illusionistic ledge that encircles the room, the space confined to this very narrow area. And as you see in the mask being held up by the boy here in the center of this image, this is inspired by theatrical backdrops and decoration that would place actors on the stage. The actions are connected across the walls. Thus, we understand this initiate being whipped, right, on the right-hand side, connects in space to the figure doing the whipping. The subjects here are going to be Greek. They are all taken from Greek art. Maenads are going to be the female followers of Dionysus, as are these allegorical figures. But the design in the shallow stage-like space, these monumental figures that move beyond the wall, are distinctly Roman, and their interest in this ideal and ultimate picture window is only going to increase as time progresses. Here, in another example of the second style wall painting, we have a cubiculum in the villa of Publius Faunius Sinister. Here, this is going to be reconstructed, though, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Now, the bedrooms, or cubiculum, are going to be only for sleeping, so they would not have the furniture we would understand today, like dressers, bureaus, or otherwise. Instead, they would have had walls decorated to entertain the person as they fell asleep or when they were getting dressed in the morning, and then a bed. The beds are going to prop up the sleeper, for until getting past the early modern era, it was believed that, in fact, you would suffocate or drown if you laid down flat at night while sleeping. The mature second style here develops from that shallow stage-like space we just looked at and moves beyond the wall, opening it up to a series of landscapes and cityscapes in new techniques of spatial construction. Here, this wall painting is understood as a picture window or a pane of glass behind which an infinite space is going to be located, but we must construct it to suggest a convincing space. Now, we're expanding beyond that shallow stage-like space we looked at in the Villa of Mysteries, and this is going to be central to the Renaissance understanding of painting and the development later on of linear perspective. Here we have instead intuitive perspective in ancient Rome developed by Roman painters and artists, whereby it appears as though parallel lines, which can be seen in cities, are going to converge at a distance. We note, however, if we lay this perspective grid over the scene, that in fact they do not converge all in the same spot, but they offer a convincing suggestion of space. Again, just like we would see in our own cities, that it appears as though parallel lines converge or come together. This is most easy to see in cityscapes. It does not work as well in landscapes. And again is inspired by theatrical decoration, for we see the masks again decorating this cityscape above the image of this goddess in the upper right-hand corner. The Greeks, however, introduced a shallow spatial recession, but as we noted, it's always coming out towards us, not moving into the scene. The Romans were the ones who developed these deep vistas, moving into and beyond the surface, drawing our attention into it, not out into our space. Thus, they develop a pseudo-mathematical way to suggest that, as seen here. Moving beyond the mathematical approach, we have Livia, the wife of Augustus, where at her villa at Livia at Prima Porta here, we have decoration for her private palace retreat, and an ultimate picture window that opens up in all four sides of this room. In it, we find there is a continuous wraparound view where a small parapet separates us from a shallow space, and then, moving beyond, a lush garden with fruit and birds moving off into an infinite distance. This is going to be using atmospheric perspective and or suggesting space by way of detail and color and saturation. Here we find that the trees, the lush fruit trees and gardens beyond, would offer a peaceful respite from the hustle and bustle of Rome. So you find that the emperor and empress retreat here periodically, much like presidents in the U.S. would go to Camp David, for instance. Now, in atmospheric perspective, we're going to be suggesting depth not by the recession of straight lines and or their apparent conversion at a distance, but instead it operates on the principle that Close up, we can see details in objects, whereas at a distance they begin to blur. As well, the color is going to be much more clear and in a local palette close to us, and will appear to desaturate at a distance, eventually turning into the same color as the sky. The idea of having a wraparound gardenscape or landscape is not new, and goes back to the Minoans, who in their frescoes would show undulating and very fantastical landscapes in their own villas that were also preserved by a volcanic eruption on Akrotiri on Thera.
The third style, interestingly enough, from 20 to 10 BCE, retreats from illusionism, and this coincides specifically with Augustus's reign. Here we can see a detail of that in Cubiculum 15 of the Villa of Agrippina Postumus. Here we have delicate linear fantasies on monochromatic backgrounds. They are not going to be derivative, but instead they are innovative. They are not like anything that came before them in ancient Greek art. Instead, in Augustan Rome, they are distinguished as distinctly Roman. On them, we have these imaginative, large, spindly frames that are going to be around types like modern canvas painting, small landscapes in the center. These, of course, can be found throughout Pompeii, painted in the third style, and would often have these idealistic vistas, much like you would find with Elysium or Paradise. In them, we often find poets or shepherds who would be in the countryside with their flocks, and the descriptions that are going to be taken from the heroic ending to these great poets and heroes' lives in Paradise. This is going to show that they are preoccupied with artistic form over content at this time, for they do not reference specific mythologies. In the fourth and final style of Roman wall painting found here at Pompeii, which lasts from 10 BCE to 79 Common Era, we find illusionism returning with the austerity of the background like the third style, along with these irrational fantasies and fragments of buildings, whereas architecture is seen just as another motif. However, we also bring in illusionism with these irrational fantasies. Here at the House of the Vetii that we began with, looking at Roman domestic architecture, we have the elaborately decorated style here shown in this example.
Here in the fourth style, we have a combination of all three previous styles, which leads to a crowded and confused scene. But we see the illusionistic inventions that the ancient Romans will come up with to suggest space beyond the surface of a wall. This is the so-called Ixion room in the Triclinium P, or dining room of the House of the Vetii we just looked at. This is painted towards the very end of and in the last decade before Pompeii would be buried by Vesuvius. This shows us the Roman penchant for eclecticism and quickly changing tastes, or as we would say, keeping up with the Joneses. To show that you have money, you need to decorate and or update your interior as often as possible. So this shows us the last of these four styles. Off to the side, we have the image for which the room is named for, Ixion. Here, in the Ixion painting, we have a myth that shows us the etiological explanation for centaurs and where they came from. For Ixion, immortal, dares to try to seduce the queen of the gods, Hera, Zeus's wife. So he punishes him by binding him to a perpetual wheel that spins forever in the clouds. He sets a trap for Ixion, making a cloud that looks like Hera, his wife. So when Ixion spies and falls madly in love with this cloud, he jumps on it and vigorously makes love to it. But when he ejaculates, his seed falls to the earth because it is a cloud. Up springs again Centaurus, the father of all centaurs. Now this is going to show the continued admiration for Greek myth and art, but is obviously meant to entertain and offer a way in which to inspire guests to discussion at dinner. This is not entirely religious. But we have all of the trappings here for naturalistic or representational art, as the figures are all located in one space, they cast consistent shadows, and we can locate them in space based on their placement within the picture plane. We also find, interestingly, in these homes in Pompeii, couples portraits that carry on that tradition we discussed going back to Etruscan examples. Here we have a wife on the left and her husband on the right, showing us how educated they are, as she holds a stylus and writing tablet to, of course, take notes in and or write letters. He holds a scroll, showing us that he also is literate. And we find that we are recording their status by including these objects. In fact, education is going to be a marker of status, for slaves are going to be illiterate generally, and the lower class cannot afford to learn how to read and write. So this couple obviously is interested in communicating that to the visitors to their villa. We find that looking out and connecting with the viewer, we also have this understanding that the husband and wife are going to be joined together in life and death as the earlier paintings we looked at. And we find that the husband, importantly, shown as tan and ruddy, looks out and connects with the viewer, as is appropriate. His role in society is public, to go out and be the face of the family in public, in the forum and other areas. The wife, however, looks outside the frame, averting her gaze from our eyes as she looks off to the left. We do not see what she's looking at. It is not part of what we see here. Instead, we're looking at a status that is shown of these two individuals.
Finally, along with the imaginative and fantastical third style, we also have erotic imagery that falls into two varieties at this time in Pompeii. They are either mythological by way of their subject matter or secular. Now, as with the other decorations, they are primarily decorative and do not function in a ritualistic fashion, or as with the cult example with the Villa of Mysteries. Instead, we have a mythological eroticism of nymphs and satyrs or various stories from mythology. Most famously, of course, are going to be chronicled by Ovid in his Metamorphoses, or series such as Priapus, or these other gods such as Jupiter and his loves. Or you have the secular imagery. These are found not only in brothels, but also in dentist offices and other very common businesses, and are going to showcase a variety of heterosexual and homosexual activities. So these are very popular and were not seen as something that was private and or shameful, but instead were just seen as decoration.
Turning to the early empire, next time we will see the rise of Augustus and the difference between rulers and their portraits in the Republican era and that of emperors in the early empire.